Okay.
Good morning, everybody. I think we should get started. Welcome to this morning's lecture by Daniel Oosthuizen on simplifying the complexities of geological data management. So it should be quite interesting. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. Please keep your videos off and your microphones muted. There will be a chance for question and answers at the end of the presentation. You can raise your hand or you can unmute your mic and join in that way. Daniel has been working in the IT and software industry for over 16 years, 10 of which have been with Micromine Africa. He has assisted Micromine in the building and implementation of their Field Marshal, GBIS, Geobank, and Geobank mobile software solutions. Part of his role has been to engage and work with consultancies as well as small, medium, and large mining houses in South Africa and around the world. So with that, Daniel, I'll hand over to you. I'll blank my video and mute my mic, so carry on, please.
Okay, no, that's fine. Okay, that was a bigger introduction than I expected. So there we go. That's pretty much me. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity to talk here today. I hope that it's going to be informative. Now, when they told me I can prepare a talk and we can talk a bit on geological data management and databases, I thought that's brilliant because I can keep people busy for probably a day, maybe two, but then they told me half an hour. So I'm going to try my absolute best to stick to the half an hour time slot. And I've even got a stopwatch going, so we're gonna try very hard to make that happen. Right, so when we started talking about you know, what we could talk about, I thought, well, obviously, with my experience, I would love to talk about geological data management. I would love to talk about databases, the importance of them, your best practices, all those kinds of things. But ultimately, half an hour is a bit short for that. So I thought the best thing I could possibly talk about is something that might actually assist in a more broad brush, a more generalist sense. Okay, so the talk today will be pretty much about how to approach the complicated matter of either entering into data management or the maintenance of data management. And we will do so by utilizing the 6 wise men that we will get to in a little bit. Okay. Let's see. There we go. Right, so that just kicks us off with a very basic question. What exactly is data management and why is it so important? Now, before we go into a complex explanation of what data management is and why it is truly important, I would like to make something very clear, and I feel there's maybe a bit of a misconception about it, but firstly, databases are not socks. Okay, there is absolutely no one-size-fits-all database out there. When it comes to databases, the best thing you can possibly do is to actually spend the time and invest the effort into making it really something that's your own and into something that will cater for you specifically. The best example I can come up with to explain that is in the olden days when they made a suit of armor for a knight. Yes, you could take another one, but it will end up bruising you and you will have lots of chafe marks and it might not necessarily work as well as you hope. It has to be tailor-fitted, it has to be tailor-made. And the very same principle applies to databases, to be honest. Right, so when we look at data management, okay, there's a very nice quote that I got online by a lady called Molly Galito. And she says that data management is an administrative process that includes acquiring, validating, storing, protecting, and processing required data to ensure the accessibility, reliability, and timeliness of data for users. Now, there's quite a few big words in there, and most of them we are fairly familiar with. When it comes to the acquiring of data, I feel most people have that down. We generally do manage to get data together. When it comes to the validation and storing, however, this is where it becomes a bit complex and ultimately protecting it. But the most important and the key features here today is the accessibility, reliability, and timeliness of the data for its users. So in my experience so far, there's almost a natural progression of data that happens. And this could either be in an existing system where the data is already being managed, albeit not ideally, or it could be in a brand new system. And this is where, when we reach that point where we might think about data management. So it starts with the gathering of data. An effective gathering of data is essential in the modern world of mining. As we know, with the way the world is going, everything is data. Everything can be translated to data. Everything is statistical. And even with the fourth industrial age, where we start bringing technology and human beings together, this will never reduce in value. There will always be value in gathering as much data as we can. That leads to this very second natural progression of what we run into. So we run into a situation where we start accumulating data, and we realize that we might not be doing it efficiently. We realize that perhaps there are better ways of doing it. We might go and find solutions that'll help us, up our productivity and find better ways to capture data and to gather. So data starts building up. Better ways are found of gathering data, which in turn increases the speed by which this buildup is happening. This leads us to the third stage, and hopefully when we get to the third stage, most guys would realize that there are problems on the horizon. Sometimes the realization comes perhaps a little too late. And that's what we like to call control mechanisms. So the moment that the buildup of our data is happening so rapidly that we can barely keep track of it, we start implementing control mechanisms, things like version controlling documents. We set up servers so we can do file storage servers. We then have our software solutions that can push the data into places. And oftentimes during this stage, this is where we end up in a situation where our efficiency by which we can gather data and our effectiveness and our reliability starts getting affected. We don't have accessibility to the data because it takes a very long time to mine for the data, or we can't trust the reliability because our version controlling might be failing, or human error might play a role in this. And of course, the timeliness. If we need to generate a complex report, but we struggle a week just to get hold of the data, or a couple of days, obviously our deadlines get pushed off. And ultimately, we end up in a situation that is quite abysmal. And that's when all control is lost. The wheels just absolutely come off of the bus. There's no effective control over data. Yes, the data is still there. The data is still accessible, but it's no longer effectively controlled. And this brings us to the question then, and this is relevant for individuals that might be thinking of perhaps moving towards a data management system, which would obviously then reside in a database, or for somebody that already has a system. And we have seen many examples of this where the efficiency of the database is being affected and things aren't working the way guys expect it to work. But by the time we get there and we ask them, okay, so what is the situation here? The database was built 8 or 9 years ago, and absolutely nothing has been done to it. There's been absolutely no maintenance. There's been no revisions of it, no evaluations. And then, of course, the wheels also have a tendency to come off of the bus. Now, the question then is, where do we begin? So what does it take to move events from the real world into a digital database? Okay, now that conversation is a very long one that I would prefer not to go into too much detail here today, but I would like to try and show you a good way of approaching this unbelievably complicated task of stepping into data management, or perhaps re-evaluating and improving the efficiency of your data management today. Typically, what would happen is we would realize we've lost control, or we would realize that the control mechanisms are failing, at which point a lot of important people go into a boardroom and they start talking and discussing the way forward, and then depression sets in. And there's no real way to move forward because the options are endless. You could go for multiple different database solutions, old ones, big ones, enterprise versions, cheap ones, free ones. There's a whole heap. And that's not even taking into account that there are companies that could actually facilitate this work for you. So the real question, and I think where most of this goes wrong and where most of the fear comes from when we are dealing with data management, and when we start talking about databases, either an existing one that is failing, or perhaps a new one, is because we are simply not guided in our approach. So the best way to begin, the best way I could possibly think of, and these are the questions that we would typically ask guys the moment they would come up to us and they would say, look, we are looking for something, we need to make a plan, is the very first question is, what objective will this database meet? And a typical response to this would be, well, we need to store data. And that's great, and that's fantastic. Unfortunately, when it comes to databases, it's a very broad topic, to which we then always reply, and I'm sure everybody has heard this to death, prior and proper planning prevents painfully poor performance. Painfully might be substituted by different words in different cultures, but the general idea remains the same. And there are 6 questions. Now, a couple of years back, I read a very interesting paper. I honestly cannot remember who the author was, but he used to call these 6 questions the 6 wise men. And without them, no planning can be achieved. So I would like to point them out. I would like to give you working examples of where they are relevant. And hopefully, moving forward, if you ever do find yourself in a situation where you should be reevaluating or performing maintenance, or even if you are going to take that scary step into the world of proper data management, databases, etc., that this will end up being that path that you can follow. So the questions are quite simply what, who, where, why, when, and how. All right, so these are the basic questions we should be asking ourselves. The first one, of course, if we're building up from the ground, we are entering into a new era. We are moving from, let's say, Excel spreadsheets or handwritten documents. We are now moving into the digital world, or we are moving into the database world. The very first question we ask ourselves is, what objectives will this database meet? It is very important that we clearly define the objective before we can do anything else. And we will go through these questions and discuss some of the questions are relating to the what and the who and the where as we go along. So the first question then, what objective are we trying to meet? The second one, who will be responsible for the database? Okay, this happens oftentimes where we would start working with guys, and unfortunately no champion has been selected. There's nobody there that can actually assume responsibility, and these are things that all of these things could slow down our deadlines. All of these things could slow down your personal deadlines or your company's deadlines. So it's very important to know who will be responsible for the database. Where and who are the users? In many big organizations, you might have a head office in Perth, or you might have an head office in Brisbane, in South Africa, and the other mining capitals of the world, but you might have operations in multiple different countries. Knowing who the users are and where they are, and whether or not there are local difficulties that we need to deal with, will actually assist us in the planning process. Why? Ultimately, that's the big question, is why are we considering a digital database? Now, this draws a little bit back to the roadmap that we've seen previously, where we've reached a point of no return. We are basically standing on the edge. We're either going to dive head first, or we are just going to stand there and stay there forever and try and manage our control mechanisms in an attempt to regain control of our data and also up our efficiency, our productivity, our reporting speed, etc. A very important question, and I think this is one that is sometimes overlooked or sometimes focused on too much, is when will we see a return on investment? Of course, there is a reason why we are going this route. There is a reason why we need to take these steps, but also there's no value in investing money into something that will have no ROI. Okay, and ultimately, how will the database be created? Now, there are many different questions that we can ask about this one, and we'll go a bit more in depth. But just to try and show the relevance of how these 6 questions are not just necessarily for building from the ground up, they're also relevant if you are reevaluating or doing maintenance on your database. From here, we can see that if we reevaluate our system, the questions we ask ourselves, the questions that become the discussion points of our meetings, will remain roughly the same, just slightly different. And I would like to just note a different quote, which is also relevant here, very much so. There's birth, there's death, and in between there's maintenance. And that is pretty much true for anything. That's true for your geological database. That's true for your geological logging procedures. That's true for anything that you could possibly think of, including even the human body. There's birth, there's death, and if there's not proper maintenance, obviously things will not work the way you expect them to, and they will not be efficient. So the way the questions actually change is once we reevaluate, and this is something we should actually be doing and investing time in, at least once every 2 years. Every year is good, but it is difficult to do these things. So once every 2 years is typically recommended. What objectives have the database met? So when we start the initial conversation, when we start our initial meeting, when we start at the database, what objectives have we met? And if you have a database that's been there for the last 10 years, and you ask this question and you have no answers because you have no idea what that database was supposed to do, and the person responsible for that database is no longer there, this shows us that there is a desperate need to reevaluate. Okay, who is currently responsible for the database? Has that person left? Is that person still there? Where and who are the users? That question remains the same. The problem is that users change a lot. Users can come in and users can leave very often, very quickly. So we need to reevaluate that. We don't want people walking around with access to our data that's no longer a part of our company. And that is something we should be taking into consideration. When did we see a return on investment? Did we see a return at all? And that is an interesting question. And it's something we will look at in depth a bit more as we go through the questions, where we establish how we actually look at how we see a return on investment. In certain circumstances, it's easy. If you have an operation, you've been using consulting firms for quite some time, you want to bring all your processes in-house and you design your own database, you put in place your own database management procedures, it's easy. You can see that you are no longer paying money to other people and so forth. But what if it's an ongoing database? What if it's maintenance we are trying to do and all of those things? In that circumstance, it's a bit more tricky to see an ROI. And ultimately, oh, I need to move the mouse, my apologies. And ultimately, how was the database created? We've had circumstances where we would speak to people, we would ask them, look, I see you've got all these different things. What were they supposed to do originally? And nobody knows. So it's very important to also reevaluate why things are in there and what their intended use was. Because ultimately you could end up with a big system that's never been reevaluated. And again, like I like to say, the wheels pretty much just come off of the bus. So let's very quickly just look a bit more in depth in some of these questions that are quite important that we can look into as we move through these 6 wise men. The first question, of course, the what. We need to ask ourselves, what is the objective? Now, you might have samplers doing sampling, face samplers doing their sampling. You might have surveyors capturing surveying data. You might have drill rigs out in the field doing drill rig. You might have people doing planning. And your objective is to consolidate all the data into a single repository and then manage that data, which is a brilliant objective, but we need to be a little bit more specific. The reason why I say that is because every single department has a department head, typically, and each department head has a certain requirement of what they need logged, how the data should look like, and ultimately how they want to report on it. So these are considerations that need to be taken into account when we ask the what and what is the objectives, because this guides every single other question. Once we know where we are heading, the road becomes clear. What information needs to be stored or managed? Again, we might not necessarily want to store and manage all the different departments. We might not necessarily have to pay let's say, a third-party vendor for 3 months worth of work if we only want to store a small amount of data and it could be done, let's say, in a week. So we need to establish these things so we can create a clear picture of what we want, so that message gets carried across. What file types or software let me just click there. What file types or software solutions are we using that needs to integrate with the new proposed solution? And that is also a biggie. Do I use anything currently that I'm capturing information in, or that I've modeled information in, or that I've planned information in, that I've done mine design, whatever the case may be, and I need to now cross-reference these things and I want to push data from both sides? What are they? And how much work would it be to bring everything into a standardized compatible format? Okay. What are the logical steps to follow? of course, this is an interesting question. We have logical steps, and the best example would be to have your first meeting. Have your secondary meeting where all parties are informed what they will do, and your third meeting, for example, would be something along the lines of everybody has gone, they've now checked what they need, what reports they need, and now you consolidate into a build. Now you either need to appoint somebody in-house that's going to do this build, that's going to make the changes, you need a project manager that comes in. So planning out all these steps takes a lot of stress out of the process, and it eliminates the uncertainties, which makes this concept scary. And it makes it complex because we don't know what we don't know. But if we don't establish where we're going, we'll never know how to get there. So this is just simplifying the complicated task of establishing what you want. And then getting what you want becomes simple. Again, what changes will data management or a database have to the current operation? Interesting. That could be something along the lines of what objectives are we trying to achieve? We need faster, more efficient logging. We have a sampler that goes out into the field and they only report back their data every 2 weeks. So we need something that's going to speed that up. So we're thinking about cloud-based services. We give them a device, they log the information. Whoop, that goes up to the cloud at the end of every day. That information comes down. So firstly, our objective was to eliminate downtime. And then, of course, what changes will be occurring is that we will see data every single day. And then, of course, what outcomes are we looking for? And this is a bit of a broad brush stroke, again, where we say, look, we want to store all our data. We want to do this thing. We want to do all the good data management things. We want to validate and acquire data, and we want to report on data, make it available efficiently, etc. But this should be a bit more personal to every single organization. And we should really contemplate what it would mean to us in an ideal world. What would be the absolute perfect scenarios, and then just bring it back down to reality a little bit. But it is good to dream, and it is good to think ahead of where you might want to end. The second question, of course, the who. So who's going to be responsible? Who's the champion? Now, this could be the in-house champion. Now, he could either be the guy that facilitates the vendor, or he could be the guy doing all your database administrator, or whoever you've appointed to do this job. The champion needs to be clearly defined. And champion needs to be clearly defined so that we know he has time available during the project time that we are specifying, and he won't disappear magically because he booked leave 6 weeks ago and now he has to take it or something along those lines. So we need to know who the champion will be. We need to know who needs to be part of the project and where do they fit into the process. If we are going to have to go through acquisitions, we are going to have to go through our accounts departments, we're going to have to go through department heads, we're going to have to go and sign off on everything, and every single step that we complete, there needs to be a sign off. Clearly identifying a list of responsible people will eliminate downtime, and also it creates that certainty of where you need to go next. And ultimately, it also shows us who the guys are with the buy-in and who the guys are with the signing power. Who do I need to get permission from? Again, this is the same standing principle. Who has the signing power? Who's going to sort this out for us, etc. And of course, who are the users affected? So we established that there are users that are affected. Once we move our system to something new, there's always affected users. And users hate change. It's a simple reality of life. But if we could include the users, if we knew who they were, if we could identify them and clearly give them instruction as to these are the plans, this is where we're heading, and we've got all this information accompanying us, then it's easier for the users to affect change, again, because it's less scary. And that resistance to change factor is still very real, very much so in the geological data management space. The where will the database be housed? You might have a massive company, you have a head office, you need the database there, but then how are all your sites going to log? So are we looking at multiple databases that might be happening, and we need to synchronize the data? Are we using a cloud-based server? And by doing these things, it already tells you who you're going to need to talk to. It tells you budgetary estimates, because you can start finding the right guys, figuring out like, okay, how much would it be to host a database in the cloud in comparison to how much would it be to just host a database at every individual site. These things give you the answers, and they kind of give you the tools to start formalizing your plan. We also have, where are we getting our funds? Of course, we need to know where everything is coming from. In certain circumstances, it might be 2 departments out of 5 that are interested in this move, and they've gotten their approval, but then the budget needs to come from those 2 departments and not just from the company in general. So we need to make sure that we know where all the funds are coming from, so that when the time comes that we need to start handing out money, when the time comes that we need to start making these decisions, we know what we are doing. And of course, how are we planning on training for our users? Where will this happen? Do we have centralized training centers where everybody can go to, or do we need to go to each individual site? Again, this helps us greatly when it comes to budgeting, because we can think about flights and accommodation and all those kinds of things. Again, ultimately, just removing the gray from the general concept of the data management, informing us more as to what is expected of us and giving us a much clearer understanding of where we are heading. And then the why. The why is quite simple. Why are we considering a digital database? Well, the wheels came off the bus. Simple as that. Our control mechanisms are failing. Things are not working the way they should. We can't report efficiently. I've got managers shouting at me every day, to get them reports. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, or I don't have access to an easily generated report or something like that. And mining for that data myself on a file server, it's creating absolute chaos. So there's a very clear reason. If you've done the questions and you're at the point where you're already considering the why, you should know why you are considering this. Okay, why are our current control measures failing? Of course, they say whoever knows whoever knows history can control the future, and that's a simple philosophy for us. If we know exactly where we go wrong, we know what we can change in order to not run into those problems again. This is relevant on maintenance or reevaluation. If we know where things went wrong originally with our new information and we're trying to build a new database, these will be focal points for us, and these become objectives for us. Again, these questions start answering each other as we move through them. Again, just removing the complexity of what we're actually trying to achieve. Why is this process worth the cost and time to implement? Again, there are easy answers and difficult answers. Easy answer, well, if I'm using a third-party consulting firm, I want to save money, I can do so. Ultimately, if you have your own database, your own operations, reevaluating and upping the productivity again and the efficiency of the system, that'll save time, that'll save money, that'll save people frustrations. So many times guys end up saying, no, the entire system is broken. They're not interested in using it when it's actually just some small thing that's not 100%. And all of our efficiency, all of our gathering that we want to do, everything goes out the window. So again, we just need to make sure that we know these things so we can plan for them. The when. When do we need to start the process? So if you have a very long procurement process, you've got a 6-month procurement process, but your boss has told you you need a database in and about a year from now, then we pretty much need to start now. Okay, it's a lot of investigation, there's a lot of thinking, it's a lot of planning, and of course, even if you do end up using a third-party vendor, there's still planning that needs to be done, there's building that needs to be done. So this is a bit of a time-consuming process sometimes. So then we know when we need to start. And ultimately, when does this process to move to a database need to be completed? We need a very clear-cut deadline, and we need a very clear-cut starting point, because all of our champions, all of our users, every single user that gets involved in this process, even third-party vendors, if that's the case, need to have those dates available. Otherwise, again, deadlines get pushed off, and it's not a great experience. When will our users be informed and included? Again, this is perhaps just from personal experience, knowing that users are oftentimes very difficult. They get quite upset if we don't to change. So we just include them as early as possible. When will the users be trained? During which steps, which implementations? Do we implement one at a time, train, and once they're schooled up, we can go to the next one? Or do we do everything as a whole? And of course, when will our champion be able to dedicate their time to this project? Again, just working around, working from home schedules, or when guys are actually going home for shore leave, or when you have leave booked or public holidays, those kinds of things. Just making sure that they actually have the time available. And then the last one that I would like to just quickly touch on is the how. How will the database be built? Now, this is either a question that's an internal question for your database administrator, or again, this is something a third-party vendor can assist with. However, it's interesting that it's only when we get to the why that we truly need to start looking at third-party vendors, even if we're looking at outsourcing this job, because when they come back to you, they're going to ask you all these questions in any way. So having all of this built up, having this entire plan in place will make the how possible for either internal or external? How will we migrate our volumes of data to a new database? That's always an interesting one. Do we want to move everything across immediately before we make it available to users, or are we going to make it available to users and have a clear cutoff date? How do we want to do this? Migration of data takes insane amounts of time, especially old historic data. So that is definitely something that should be considered as part of the process. How will we measure the success or failure of this project? Again, we've established our objectives. We know what we want to achieve. But how do we measure success? And that is unfortunately something nobody can tell us. This is organization specific. We need the samplers to have their data come in every single day. Okay, and we are using a database, we are using software, it syncs up, it comes down, we've got access to everything. Yes, we can check that. That is working. But if we had a bit more obscure objectives, just upping the productivity, it becomes a bit tricky to measure the success there. So establishing how you want to measure success on the project is also quite important, especially for the upper echelons within a company, so that they also know what to keep an eye out for and see whether or not they can see the positive shifts. How do we mitigate potential risks? So that's an interesting one. Potential risks, of course, we're sitting right in the middle of one. A lot of the work that a lot of people are doing right now has to have come to a halt because of a global pandemic. Now, this is a very rare case, of course, but again, people not being available, it's a risk. Sites getting shut down, it's a risk. Having some form of accident at a site during this time frame, they're all little risks that can actually end up pushing out deadlines and can determine our original planning. And it's things that we can take into account ultimately. How do we implement the changes with minimal disruption to the lives of the users? Ultimately, users hate change. So if we wanted to implement something, we need to also take into account how we will disrupt them minimally. How do we measure ROI? Of course, knowing how we successfully measure ROI is also a good one, because return on investment is most likely looked at as a type of cash, but it's not always the case. And then, of course, how will our data flow and processes operate post the database? Again, this is kind of your utopian end of everything has worked out perfectly, or dream of where we want to be one day. And then, of course, just turning it a little bit back to reality, so that ultimately we can get the best possible system, the best solution, the best plan that we can get, possibly. But of course, cemented within reality, as you know, technology can have its impact on it, etc. So I'm hoping that when we look at the concept of data management, that we understand that data management happens. It's a process, but it's not a process that just happens overnight. It's not a process that's easily implemented. However, by taking the correct approach from the get-go, we simplify this process for ourselves for both new implementations or new databases, and for re-evaluating or maintaining existing databases by simply asking our 6 wise men the correct questions, finding what makes it unique for us and brings value for us, and ultimately then moving into an era where we get that perfect system, where we get an ROI, and we can get those attainable objectives, and we can hit them. So I truly hope that today might have at least opened a door to maintenance, or given you a better kickoff point on how to approach and simplify the complexities, my apologies, of geological database management. And I think that's half an hour.
Daniel, thank you very much. It's exactly a half hour.
Yes, there we go.
We've got some time for questions and comments. Now, I see I've got 2 people raising their hands here.
Oops, I stopped the video now. Yes.
Carry on. Mr.
Ines, you have a question?
Daniel, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Okay, great. So you talked about the wheels coming off the bus, and then
Yes,
people start looking at software solutions, or not software solutions, but database management solutions.
sure.
being a user of the data, how do you suggest we, before the wheels come off the bus, how do you suggest we propose a change to management, to suggest a proper management software? You know, I don't know if my question makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense, and it's to be fair, it's one of the struggles that we oftentimes work with, and it's unfortunately a little bit situational. Look, we can predict where things are going. For example, if you know you are logging and you know that you are logging fine, but it's inefficient, then by being able to showcase where, for example, somebody requests data from you, and you can literally take their mail and you can go look for the data, you can bring that back, and you can actually start recording things like turnaround times on when you request data or when data is requested from yourself. You can put that in there. If you wanted to look at things like reporting, sometimes you need to do complex reporting, especially if you're doing QA/QC on sampling, or if you're doing, you know, your channel sampling, your blasting, your phase sampling. Those you can get some nice big reports on. How long does it typically take to generate this report? Are you able to track how long the lab takes before they send information back? How much time do you spend marrying, again, your analysis results to the original samples that you wanted to spend out with? You can keep track of those things. And if you have a proper data management process, okay, so it's on top of a database and you are looking to push a little bit to get something proper in place, the general answer would be that if you ask for data, you can retrieve it within seconds, not hours. If you want to run a very complex report, it might take a day or two to build, but from there, you are able to run it repeatedly, and you can do so within seconds. So taking processes that one of our clients that we have, they used to they send about 500 samples. They were exploration guys. They sent 500 samples a day to the lab, and then they need to bring back the lab analysis. It took them they were about 2-3 weeks behind on marrying the analysis versus requested. We got a proper system in place, and you know, it ends up going from being 3 weeks behind to being exactly on time, and every time it comes in, it takes them 10 minutes. That is the kind of arguments that we end up having. That's the proof of concept that I would look at, is actually looking for where you get frustrated with waiting times and things that are slow versus how it could run in an optimal environment.
Thanks. Great advice.
Okay.
Christopher, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I do. Hi, Daniel. Thanks for a great talk.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Thanks. Throughout the talk, you repeatedly mentioned ROI. My question is, does it have to be monetary, or
No.
it can be qualitative? Because
absolutely,
you see, when you start mentioning ROI to management, more especially at the mines, everyone is inclined to think costs.
I'm with you.
You know, it's very difficult to get the message across that,
yes,
you know, it's going to improve efficiency. So most of these issues with database management systems, you'll find that it's not necessarily monetary value that you'll derive out of there, but it's qualitative. Yeah, and then
Okay, I agree with you 100%. But also, this does translate into actual real-world money. We need to remember that there's a cost of employment for every single employee. Okay, so for me, having a job, they need to provide me with a laptop. They need to provide me with internet connection, a phone, etc., etc., etc. So there's this cost of employee that exists. Now, if you have, let's say, 4 people that's currently data logging, they could be doing better things. They could be doing different things, but all 4 of them are required to log data because of an inefficient system. It's a very simple argument to make by saying, you know what, ultimately you can save the cost of 2 people doing only data logging, and you can reapply them somewhere else, because if you up your efficiency and your productivity by use of proper data management, you save that cost inherently. You get 2 additional employees somewhere else at 0 cost, and your original employees actually cost you 2 less. So basically, you're getting 2 guys for free in a different department, and all you do is you check how much you pay them every month. You put that together, and you subtract that from the cost that you paid to originally implement a system, and that'll give you an ROI in a real money value. but also there is a massive cumulative knock-on effect. If we are dealing inefficiently with data, we get disgruntled, we get depressed, we get upset. We don't want to do it, right? Because if anything is difficult, it's human nature. We don't like to do it. But if you have an efficient system where you can get things done in 10 minutes and you can actually go on with interesting work or stuff you prefer more, you will be more efficient and you'll be more prone to get it done correctly and efficiently the first time. So there's this massive knock-on effect, and it's quite cumulative, not just on ROI, but in efficiency, productivity, satisfaction in work for your employers. Plus, if you put a proper database management system in there, ultimately they need to get training on it, which also again gives them new skills. So that goes into staff development as well. So there's a lot of interesting ways that we can push for things like ROI by upskilling, etc., etc., etc. So it's if you think about it, then yeah, you can actually have quite a few different arguments to be made.
Okay, thanks. The last thing from me is just a comment. You spoke about data champion, more especially when you implement this type of systems, and I agree fully with you. I've worked for a lot of different sites, and in some of the sites, when I get there and there wasn't a data champion, you can realize that the data was basically in disarray. And ultimately, people want to change the data management software because they don't understand it and move to another one, whereas there's basically no problem with the current existing data management software. So thanks for that.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've seen it so many times. Before you think about moving, first retrain and reevaluate. And if by then you still think about moving, go for it. But first retrain and reevaluate. That's typically what we found.
Are there any other questions or comments? I guess not. I don't see anything.
Okay, perfect.
Daniel, let me take this opportunity to thank you very much for presenting to us.
Thank you.
I think it was a good generalized presentation and makes all of us think about data again.
Yep.
Can be a nasty management problem.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much for coming in this morning and doing this.
It's a pleasure.
We will be putting this onto a YouTube GSSA channel in the next few days. So thank you very much, all the attendees. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll end the meeting now. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. Cheers.